Well, um, my name's Brandon Fabel. I'm a history major in my junior year, and this paper I'm presenting is a historiography on Ulysses S. Grant. Historiography is basically not about the history of the topic itself, but about interpretations of it through different historians and authors throughout the years. So, one of the greatest generals in American history is also one of the country's most tragic figures, even after his death. After great victories at Vicksburg and Appomattox, Ulysses S. Grant was hailed as a hero who would go on to even greater things than commanding general of the United States Army. Soon after the war, he would become 18th President of the United States, where he led for 2 terms. Unfortunately, his presidency is seen as one of the worst presidencies, filled with controversy from his surrounding cabinet. So today, most people remember General Grant as the Union general that led the North to victory over the South. But most people also remember him for his terrible presidency, which is rated one of the worst of all presidents. Henry Adams, when he heard of Ulysses S. Grant's cabinet members, described as the progress of evolution from President Washington to President Grant was alone enough evidence to upset Darwin. So, this paper is focused on different authors' interpretations of throughout time. Grant's reputation has gone way up the ranks of president rankings, and many authors today, including Ron Chernow, are trying to find the highlights of Grant's presidency and his life, besides just being general, that propel him way forward than older historians made Grant out to be. Through detailed research into his famous memoirs, personal history, and presidential writings, there has been a surplus of highly acclaimed historical books that have pushed for Grant's rightful recognition that I just mentioned. Not denying the corrupted cabinet that Grant had, these books advocate for his military career and presidency, the parts that were actually should be remembered. 3 of these books include American Ulysses, President Grant Reconsidered, and Ulysses S. Grant, who all present these arguments. It is an overview and historical analysis not on Grant himself, but the authors and historians who want the opportunity for the enigmatic, inspiring, and complex story of American Ulysses to become accessible to the wider audience he deserves. While all of these books do cover the Civil War, which Grant is most known for, and many younger people only know him for, his role in these authors address reasons why Grant rose through the ranks during the war all the way to the top, becoming Lincoln's right-hand man and ending the war. In American Ulysses, historian Ronald C. White always comes back to a similar set of qualities and characteristics that led to his rising success. He refers to Grant's resolve and perseverance that kept him focused always on the matter at hand. From the moment Grant entered the war, he was fighting for somebody else. White writes that Grant was always active during battle, even if he was not fighting. Grant was everywhere, behind and beside his men, offering more encouragement. It was this leadership that would propel him to be commanding general of the Union Army and win the war. While he may have been a quiet man during commencement dinners or social events, Grant was anything but silent while commanding. After battle, he was always grateful for the men that fought alongside him. In his reports after battle, the general was always quick to thank his soldiers for their duty. This was evident during victory and defeat. This temperament of his let Grant rise through rankings and gain recognition. Also, his silence during his presidency would lead many people to expose him specifically for the corruption in his cabinet, even though it was not him specifically. Grant was more of an Eisenhower or a Coolidge, not so much a Wilson or a Clinton. He was not very charismatic, and he did not talk much. unless he was binging on alcohol, which was a major problem of his. The temperament of Grant led to a relationship with Abraham Lincoln that formed a bond that would ultimately win the war. White notes that while Grant was definitely thankful for all the praise that he received, nothing was close to the recognition given to him by the president. Throughout the war, Lincoln had trouble finding the man that he thought was capable to lead the Union Army. Scott, McClellan, Halleck, he cycled through generals who he thought there was potential in, but ultimately disappointed him. Many times he dismissed these generals, and he would be agitated, wondering who would actually help lead the war. One of Grant's greatest attributes as general was strategy. This is what ultimately led him to victory over Robert E. Lee. Through the effective use of strategy, Grant was able to secure an important win at Vicksburg, a siege which lasted from December 26, 1862 to July 4, 1863, containing naval operations in 11 different battles. Lincoln wrote a letter to Grant after the battle praising his strategic mind. White in his book includes a quote from the letter sent to Grant, stating that after his detailed recitation of disagreements with Grant's strategy, President Lincoln confessed, "I now wish to make the personal acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong." This was made a year before he became commanding general in 1864, and it was high praise that ultimately led to that appointment. In Ulysses S. Grant, by Josiah Bunning, former military officer and college president, he gives his reasons to why he thinks Grant was so much more successful than the other officers during the war. Bunning's reasoning agrees with White and shares a common view. The most capable general of the war achieved his success precisely because he could, as we would say today, deal with such chaos, could respond to the slaughter, the hideous costs, in ways that approached a certain kind of calm objectivity. He was able to stay calm amid the crazy events of war and lead his soldiers capably even when something went wrong. As can be seen in his memoirs that he later wrote while he was dying, one of Grant's biggest attributes was he's multitasking and the many different processes that could go on in his mind. He could think geographically, strategically, and logistically, which all helped him win the war. He was also able to make certain decisions that many other generals did not have the ability to, even if they brought forth consequences that did not always end well. Lincoln admired this drive and the fact that he was always willing to go through with it. It is wrong to attribute Grant's success to a sudden transformation of character or to the serendipity of finding himself in a profession and time in which his abilities would suddenly and startlingly reveal themselves. These were clear and present with Grant all throughout his life. It is not fair to Grant to make this claim that he underwent a massive change in personality and character during the war. These kind of traits are present in other areas of his life that can be seen with historical proof, and also during his presidency. This is a universal opinion held on Grant by many people. What many people do not know is that they are trying to tell others is that Grant had these attributes in many parts of his life, even before he came into war when he was seen as a failure. One of Grant's biggest issues in his life was his alcohol problem. Ron Chernow describes that there's a difference between being a drunkard and being an alcoholic. Grant was not a drunkard where he had moral problems that led to his drinking and that resulted from it. He simply just drank. He would go from 2 to 3 months periods at a time without drinking and would only drink after major battles, where he would take a small trip to a small village all by himself, and none of his officers would ever see him actually drink. This shows how serious Grant was about being general, and that him being an alcoholic did not play a role in this. Chernow describes this as being a high-functioning alcoholic. And Lincoln later, when he heard of Grant drinking, said, "Can you send a barrel of whatever whiskey he drinks to all my other generals?" Grant's presidency is what most people deem to be the failure that destroyed his reputation. This is because of the corruption that was evident in his cabinet, which is not a lie, and no historian will deny this. Professor Frank J. Scaturo included some examples of critics who proved this in his book President Grant Reconsidered. In the American political tradition, Richard Hofstadter effectively summarizes historians' traditional verdict on the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant in 12 words. Not much need to be said. Grant's administrations are notorious for their corruption. What these authors are trying to claim is that this was not Grant's fault and that he was completely honest in office. One of his problems was that he trusted his cabinet too much, and then this backfired when most of them were extremely corrupt. Political and civil equality was one of the main goals of his presidency, and he fought valiantly for it during it. One of the biggest areas of his presidency that historians use to prove that Grant was a much better president and figure was his interactions with Reconstruction and the newly freed African Americans. During his presidency, he was so aggressive with these reforms that it saw the disappearance of many racist groups, including the KKK, who were gone for more than an entire year during his demonstration in South Carolina. The Ku Klux Klan was practically dead and would not appear until the following century. When discussing his platform for presidency during his election, Bunning mentioned the importance of Reconstruction and rights that Grant sought for. The platform supported congressional Reconstruction. It demanded equal suffrage to all loyal men at the South. While acknowledging that the states themselves should act on this controversial issue, several northern states being among those continuing to withhold the franchise from blacks. Bunning states that Grant wanted not just part of America to make sure that every individual had equal rights, but all parts of the country, and he would not rest until this was done. White comments heavily on Grant's fight against the Ku Klux Klan, dedicating an entire chapter in his book towards this. He notes Grant would give up personal things to keep this fight alive, including his own time off. On August 31st, Grant cut short his vacation at Long Branch to return to Washington and personally take charge of the fight against the Klan. Grant was willing to give up whatever he could to make sure no race would get oppressed, no matter who they were, and while he was commanding general of the Union Army, he appointed many minorities to higher positions. After his presidency, Grant's life was a roller coaster that ultimately ended in success and defeat. After he left office in 1977, he was swindled by a con man and lost almost all of his money. That same year, he developed throat cancer that would ultimately kill him. Wanting to preserve his life and his mind, he worked with Mark Twain to construct his memoirs, which are seen as some of the greatest writings of any president or military figure. Many try to argue that Mark Twain wrote most of these, but through research and then actual quotes from Mark Twain himself, he said, "Their style is flawless. No man can improve upon it." But my later experience has taught me two lessons. First, that things are seen plainer after the events have occurred. Second, that the most confident critics are generally those who know the least about the matter criticized. This is a quote from the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. These authors know that his presidency was corrupt, and there's just no denying this. Their main point is to just make sure that Grant was considered much more highly in this new wave of Grant history. From things like Reconstruction, where he caught the favor of Frederick Douglass even more than Lincoln, being on the right side of many Reconstruction-era issues, to his military history, being one of the most famous military figures in American history. This is the point all authors agree on, and the main point of this historiography on Ulysses S. Grant, 18th President of the United States. Thank you. Any questions?
What grants do you particularly like?
For my historical methods class last semester, for Dr. Seiss, the question is, why did I choose Grant for this paper? We were supposed to write a historiography on an event that we found interesting, and Ulysses S. Grant, when I found out about this book by Ron Chernow, called Grant, and why he was his reputation was being restored throughout history. I thought that was very interesting, and he was a president I did not know much about. I knew he was commanding general of the Union Army, but last year I didn't even know that eventually he would become president before I took a American President's class. So I thought that was very interesting.
What do you think of Grant now? Do you think he was a good president, or do you still think he's too controversial?
Um, he's definitely controversial. One of the most controversial American presidents. I think there's many good aspects to his presidency that are being discovered, like his fight against the Ku Klux Klan and being on Reconstruction, even if the Reconstruction ultimately turned out to be a failure. And his corruption was his corrupt cabinet members, and he himself was too trusting of them, which led to many of these issues. Was the events that came, or the results from his presidency, good? Not entirely, but I think obviously he was a good man, and I think being a good president with the right mind. Thank you.